Wondered why, after 400 years, African Americans have not created measurable wealth collectively. What is the problem? Is it black culture or systemic racism? This is part 2 of that message.
Get ready for a kingdom encounter. The kingdom of God, justice and righteousness. A kingdom encounter. Teaching believers, training leaders, transforming communities. It's a kingdom encounter.
So yes, I'm going to continue teaching today from the topic of why, after 400 years, African Americans have not created measurable wealth in this country. What is the problem? Is it black culture or systemic racism? Let's get into it. Dr. Claude Anderson says black Americans owned 1.5% of this nation's wealth during slavery. And today, 157 years after slavery ended, black Americans, according to Dr. Claude Anderson, still owns only approximately 1.5% of this nation's wealth. So basically, this means that black Americans haven't created any black wealth collectively in 400 years in North America. And again, I'm asking why or why not? Assuming that Dr. Anderson's figures are correct, why haven't we created measurable wealth in this nation? Now, this question is not really a new question. It is one that two African American leaders debated in the 19th and 20th century. Booker T. Washington and Dr. W.B. Du Bois. The question was slightly different, but both men wanted to see black equality, yet they had different ways of reaching that goal. Booker T. Washington's position as a former slave was that equality would come when blacks would prove their worthiness to whites through sacrifice, discipline, delayed gratification, personal economic success, business development, etc. He believed that our focus should have been on practical education so we could be useful to white society. And with that in mind, he created Tuskegee Institute for the purpose of training blacks to do mainly industrial work. Now, this position brought him in sharp contrast to W.B. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois, born to a white French father and a black woman in Massachusetts, he graduated from Fisk University and Harvard University with the BA degree. And he was the first black to earn a PhD from Harvard, and he was the first black NAAC president. Now, Dr. Du Bois had a very different, extremely different position of how to achieve black equality. After studying the city of Philadelphia, Dr. Du Bois believed black Americans consist of roughly 4 groups. The first group, the upper class, the aristocrats, the top 10%. The second group was the respectable working class blacks, which consisted of waiters, porters, butlers, etc. Had good, at that time, middle class jobs. The third class was the poor African Americans. And on the bottom, that bottom 6% left, was what Dr. Du Bois called criminals. And so he believed that the top 10%, he called them the talented 10th, had a responsibility of helping lift the rest of the Black community up. So he believed those who had acquired some wealth, who had acquired some power, those Blacks were responsible for leading the rest of the Black community out of poverty and inequality and second-class citizenship. So this put him and Booker T. Washington in sharp contrast. Now, spoiler alert, let me tell you where I stand. My belief incorporates a little bit of both of these gentlemen. And to be specific, I believe the problem or the reason Black Americans have not created wealth, measurable wealth, collectively over 400 years is because of systemic racism. To be even broader and to give you a greater context, I believe it is the result of 400 years of racial oppression. Moreover, I do acknowledge that there are problems in Black culture, but I believe those cultural issues that are preventing Blacks from creating wealth, that are playing a part in that, are themselves the product of 400 years of racial oppression. I suggest you read books like The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and let him tell you in his own words in that fascinating book how Black Americans dealt with slavery and sort of contrast the difference in Black Americans, and not only the differences, but the similarities between Black Americans during slavery, based on Frederick Douglass's account, and Black Americans today. And then if you ever get a chance, travel to the continent of Africa, visit some of the countries over there in Western Africa, and sort of contrast the similarities and the differences between Blacks here and Blacks there in Africa. So this brings me to a question that Frederick Douglass, my favorite antebellum Black leader, asked. He asked this question, and I think it's still a very pertinent question today. Quote, Frederick Douglass said, "The real question, the all-commanding question, is whether American justice, American liberty, American civilization, American law, and American Christianity can be made to include and protect alike and forever all American citizens." Now, I do believe I have this, or I can put it on the screen for you. Sorry, I don't think I do. Let me quote it for you again. Frederick Douglass asked this all-important question. He asks, the real reason, the all-commanding question, the real question, the all-commanding question is whether American justice, American liberty, American civilization, American law, and American Christianity. Now that sticks out with me as a Christian. Frederick Douglass asks whether American Christianity can be made to include and protect alike and forever all American citizens. Obviously, he was focused on the African American citizen. And he asked this very critical question: whether the institutions that make up America, whether the American justice system, the American liberty, American civilization, the entire civilization, American law, and American Christianity, whether they could be made to include and protect African American citizens. What a powerful question. 400 years of being here would cause you to answer that question in the negative, because African Americans still fight 400 years later for equality. And that inequality, that racial inequality, is no more stark than in the area of wealth. The wealth gap between blacks and whites in America is vast. That gap is vast. And it has been there since 1619. Now, the purpose of this message, I told you last week, is to do three things: to eliminate, expose, educate. To eliminate, expose, educate. To eliminate confusion among African Americans regarding why we haven't built wealth collectively. Because you got some Black Americans who say it's cultural, some Black Americans who say it's systemic racism. Well, how can we ever formulate any sort of strategies to overcome inequality if we have that divide amongst us? And again, it's not a new divide. It was there in the 19th century. It was there again, as I said, between W.B. Du Bois as well as Booker T. Washington. It still exists. And it plays a part in us overcoming the wealth gap that I'm talking about today. So I want to eliminate that confusion. Number two, I want to expose the racist methods that whites and the United States government use to prevent or to destroy Black wealth creation. Now, you sharp-minded people notice that I said the methods that whites and the government used to prevent Black wealth creation and to destroy it. Even after Black Americans created some wealth, the government and white Americans destroyed that wealth or took that wealth or stole that wealth. And I'm going to show you what methods they used. And then third of all, my purpose is to educate Americans, African Americans and Americans, but especially African Americans, as to what systemic changes, the pathway we need for Black Americans to begin to create and maintain wealth collectively. Now, let me stop here and focus on the word collective. It is very important in this message because there are some very wealthy African Americans. As I told you last week, we can name them. We can name them. You got the Oprah Winfreys. You got the Michael Jordans. You got the Jay-Z's. You got the P. Diddy's. You got the LeBron James. You got Robert Smith. You got many, some very wealthy African Americans. But you know what? You could take all the wealth of those famous African Americans, put it all together, and it would be a small percentage of the wealth that's owned by, say, a company like Nike. Nike's worth, its net worth, is worth much more than all the collective wealth of the people that I just mentioned. For that matter, Nike's wealth could be worth that of many, the wealth of many African Americans. Now watch this. We know that African Americans spend quite a bit. I believe the number now is perhaps $1 trillion or so annually. We spend a lot. That's my point. But I'm not talking about what we earn and spend necessarily. I'm talking about wealth, which is the difference of your assets minus your liabilities. Take everything you own, subtract everything you owe, and that's your wealth. And collectively, Black Americans own very, very little wealth. And I'm simply asking the question, why is that the case after 400 years of being in North America? Now, again, I believe it is because of 400 years of racial oppression. I cannot divorce 400 years of racial oppression from our current situation. Some people want to. Some people want us to overlook it. Some people even accuse me and others of playing the race card or being victims, playing the victim card. Just because we connect the last 400 years. In fact, we're still living those last 400 years. How can we possibly disconnect ourselves from that history? In my opinion, folks who try, African Americans who try to do that are ignorant of the devastation of those years. So I'm going to address some of that today. So when I talk about 400 years of racial oppression, I'm looking at that in 3 sections. First, slavery. Second, Jim Crow, apartheid. And third, present day systemic racism. And it's what some folks call the new Jim Crow. So again, slavery, Jim Crow, apartheid, and present day systemic racism. Now, let's take a look at slavery. It's an unpleasant thing to look at. Many of us say that slavery was abolished 157 years ago. Why are we looking back? Well, first of all, that would be untrue. Slavery has not completely been eradicated in this country. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except for punishment of crimes. And that one particular exception to the 13th Amendment is one big reason why we've not been able to create wealth, because that exception has given and been used to create mass incarceration. So that is not entirely true when people say, why are we looking back? Why are we going back to slavery? Because, again, it wasn't completely abolished, and a lot of what happened during slavery continued to impact Black Americans in America today. And that's because the American slave system was so deeply embedded into the American culture, into the American civilization, that remnants of it still are with us today. In fact, there are still clauses in the United States Constitution that came about or were added to support and protect slavery. So slavery, the ghosts of slavery are still with us. Now, to be certain, slavery has existed since ancient times. Often slavery occurred because of debt, because of punishment for crime, prisoners of war, child abandonment, children born into slavery. But what we're going to see this morning is that American slavery was uniquely evil. It was worse than any form of slavery in human history. Now, we need to look at the enslavement of the Jews because there are some serious lessons there. So let's go to our presentation. Now, before I do, I want to read something here that sort of put in context what I'm saying to you. The Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University, a group of scholars issued a report recently, and it says, quote, white Americans have been provided with up escalators they can ride to reach their goals without hurdles. Meanwhile, Black Americans have been forced onto down escalators, which they must run up to reach their destination. So we see here that white Americans have been put on a trajectory, on an escalator that sort of propels them, that kind of catapults them to economic prosperity. Conversely, Blacks have been forced onto a downward trajectory, a downward escalator, if you will, that produces poverty. And that is written in the customs, in the laws. Again, it is the result of 400 years of racial oppression. This group of scholars say throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, politicians and government officials provided wealth starter kits that included land, government-backed mortgages, farm loans, a social safety net, and business in education subsidies to white families while intentionally excluding Black families. These wealth drivers of yesteryear continue to shape wealth ownership today. That is that upward escalator that these scholars are talking about versus the downward escalators that Black Americans must contend with. So now let's talk about slavery, and let's start our discussion of slavery by looking at the children of Israel. We're Christians, we're believers, we're God followers, God chasers. We believe in the Bible, and the Lord left us an example in his word of a people who were enslaved for longer than we actually. They were enslaved for 400 years. We were enslaved for a little bit under 250 years. So there are lessons to be learned from this story. And one lesson that stands clear is that perhaps the most damaging and harmful effect of slavery is the long-term psychological and mental damage it does to enslaved people. Again, perhaps the most damaging, and slavery is damaging, period, but maybe the most damaging is how it impacts people psychologically and mentally. That may be the damage that carries on oftentimes from generation to generation to generation. And so God dealt with that with the children of Israel. So let's turn our attention to Numbers chapter 13. And here is the chapter where the Lord had delivered Israel from Egyptian bondage. And he had promised them through their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that he would deliver them from bondage, Egyptian bondage, and he would take them into what he called the promised land, a land that flowed with milk and honey and prosperity. That was his promise. That was his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He renewed it with each generation. So God was serious about fulfilling his covenant. So after he delivered Israel from Egyptian bondage, he instructed Moses to send spies into the promised land. And those spies came back and gave Israel a very bad report. So we're back here, Numbers 13. Thus they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who lived in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalekite is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There also we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. All of that was damage that slavery had done to them. Their inability to trust and believe God to take them into the promised land was the negative impact of having been enslaved for those years. And it's the reason why I say maybe the most damaging, harmful impact of slavery is what it does to the mind of the enslaved person. They become dependent on the enslaver. They can't see themselves, even with God's help, prospering, creating wealth. They can't see themselves living in freedom and liberty. They take on the mindset of a child. All of that is the harmful impact of slavery. So God had to deal with it. So let's see how he dealt with it. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried. And the people wept that night. All the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, watch this, would that we had died in the land of Egypt. In other words, I wish we had stayed in slavery and died as enslaved people. Or would that we had died in this wilderness. Look at their preoccupation with death. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? In other words, to return to slavery? So they said one to another, let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Look at that. Look at how slavery had just completely damaged them psychologically. So much so that they wanted to go back into slavery. So much so that they became dependent upon the enslaver. They had more trust in the enslaver than they had in God. Let me say that again. They had more trust in the enslaver than they had in God and in themselves. Slavery had just beat them down psychologically. Slavery had broken them down psychologically. Are you getting what I'm trying to say? And so a people who have been enslaved like that will come out of that enslavement. Most of them, we saw out of the 12 spies, 10 of them returned with a bad report. Only 2, Caleb and Joshua, had a good report. And by the way, it shouldn't be lost on you how much I admire Caleb and Joshua. I remember when I first became a believer, rededicated my life to the Lord, Caleb and Joshua just stood out to me. Those were the kinds of believers that I endeavored to be. The kind who will believe God, no matter what and no matter who says otherwise. I believe God. I believe him. I believe his word. I believe his promises. I'll stand on his word. I'll stand on his promises. If he says it, that settles it. I don't care about the giants. I don't care about the challenges. I don't care about the mountains. I'll speak to them because God backs me. But people who've been damaged by slavery just find it difficult to have that freedom of mind and faith. And it can be so, that damage can be so deep, so profound, that God can't do anything with that people. And that was the case with Israel. And so the Lord says about those people who believed that bad report, none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, for they did not follow me fully, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua, the son of Nun, for they have followed the Lord fully. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years until the entire generation of those who had done evil. What was the evil they done? They didn't believe God. What was the evil they done? What was the evil they did here? They didn't believe God. They murmured against God. They didn't trust God. In the sight of the Lord, all of them were destroyed. Are you seeing what I'm trying to get you to see here? Slavery can warp people psychologically. Our minds are powerful, powerful instruments that God gave us, but they can be warped. And sometimes that warpedness can be so deep, so internal that it's hard to recover. Sometimes it's not possible. And God says, I got to get rid of them. And he didn't get rid of them because he didn't love them or because he disliked them. No, he loved them, obviously. God is love. But he got rid of them to protect the rest of them. It was like a circumcision. He was getting rid of the dead foreskin. He was proning Israel. God does that. He's a husbandman. He is the potter. We're the clay. Sometimes he will cut off the rough edges. Sometimes he will remove people from our lives so that we can get to the next level. Let him do that. Don't hold on. Don't hold on to people who are not helping you get to your promised land, to that place that God is trying to get you. And so that's what he did here. Now, there are two things that distinguish Israel from African Americans post-slavery. So keep in mind, what I'm doing here is I am contrasting Israel's time of slavery with African Americans. There are lessons to be learned. God included their story in the Bible because there are powerful lessons to learn. And I hope that you're getting some here. Now, there are two things that stand out to me about Israel's versus African Americans post-slavery experience. All right, let's look at them. First, God separated Israel from her enslaver. God separated Israel from her enslavers. That has not happened with African Americans. Slavery ended in this country for the most part, but we have remained right here with the enslaver. I mean, literally, after slavery ended in 1865, don't forget my caveat about the 13th Amendment. But after slavery ended in 1865, oftentimes those freedmen just continued to stay on the plantation of the enslaver. And sometimes the condition, the chains, the legal chains of slavery were gone, but the the psychological, the mental, the economic, the emotional change were still very much present. In fact, now African Americans were dealing with an enraged former enslaver who were angry to see that slavery had ended, who were angry to see that their cash cow was now over. So quite often, the enslaver became even more brutal and immediately started implementing schemes to keep the newly freed African in slavery. Unlike Israel, whom God completely separated from their enslaver. And I believe that is a huge reason why Israel has been able to really grow and thrive and create all kinds of wealth, because they got a complete and fresh start. We never got that. Slavery, the Civil War was fought, the 13th Amendment was ratified. However, we continue to live pretty much under the thumb of the enslaver. We went from the legal system of slavery to sharecropping, to contract labor, to, again, mass incarceration, to Jim Crow. We're going to talk about that next week. So we never fully did get the opportunity to get a fresh start. But even before we talk about ending slavery, I'm going to take you into some depth about how horrible slavery was, because we don't really know. You don't really learn in history in high school how evil slavery was. We don't learn it. And now many of these GOP states have prohibited teachers from teaching slavery at all, because they don't want us to know, and they don't want to remind themselves or their children how evil the American slave system was. It was uniquely evil. So don't turn your head. Don't be indifferent. Don't say, I don't want to hear this, or don't say, what does this have to do with Black Americans now? A lot. A lot. The second thing that distinguishes Israel from Black Americans post-slavery is that God separated Israel from those Israelites who had been damaged by slavery. So not only did he pull them away from the enslaver, but he also separated young Israelis from the older generation whose minds had been warped. Again, that didn't happen with us either. So those African Americans who were broken down and damaged from slavery sort of passed that slave mentality on to the next generation of Black Americans. And then that generation sort of passed some of those slave relishes on to the next generation. And keep in mind, slavery only ended 150 something years ago. That's roughly 3 to 4 generations. So we're not talking about slavery didn't end a millennium ago or 2 millennia ago or sometime before the birth of Christ. No. 157 years ago. And again, in many ways, the system of slavery, or the Confederate spirit that fought to preserve slavery, still exists. I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up 30 minutes from Jacksonville, North Carolina, which has one of the largest Marine Corps bases in the country, maybe the largest. It's called Camp Lejeune. Camp Lejeune is named after a Confederate general. I also grew up about an hour from one of the largest Army bases, Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg is named after a Confederate general. And so you go anywhere in the area that I grew up around and where you grew up around, if you grew up in North America, especially in the South, there are monuments everywhere to slavery. There are reminders. There are memorials to slavery. There are things to remind us that white Americans put there to make it clear. White power, white supremacy, forever. Okay? Now let me see here what just happened. All right, my camera screen went black. My camera screen went black. I don't know why. It just went black. But I tell you what, I'm going to continue. In fact, let me tell you this. When I got up this morning to do my message, I had written about 10 pages of notes, and I could not find those notes. I couldn't find those notes. I had to start all over again. I had to start all over again. So I'm going to finish this message with the PowerPoint. I don't know why my screen went black. I'm not sure. But I'm going to finish it with the PowerPoint. All right. As a matter of fact, you know what? We can stop here. It's been about 49 minutes. Next week, we're going to look at the horrors of the American slave system. The horrors. We're going to take a look at the horrors of the American slave system, and you will see how it interfered with our forefathers' ability to create any kind of wealth. Next week. All right, I'm looking forward to it. Nothing's going to stop this message. So, you come back with me next week. I love you. God bless you. Have a good one.
Untitled.